At my backyard, BBQ, my son-in-law, shoved me into the hot grill in front of 15 guests when I refused to give him my house. My hand hit the burning metal, and everyone stood frozen in silence. My son-in-law quickly said he just stumbled, but then my own daughter looked at my burned hand and said, "Dad, you're being selfish. You're making everything harder than it needs to be." They thought they had broken an old man with no one left to fight for him, until I made one call. That story begins on the morning I turned 72. I was sitting out on the back porch by myself, a mug of black tea warming my hands, watching the sun ease up over the maple tree Lorraine had planted back in the year we first moved in. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a house when it holds more memories than it does people. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If these stories speak to you, consider staying close and following along so you never miss one. Before we get into it, I'd love to know, what are you up to right now while you listen? Driving somewhere, working in the kitchen, maybe just resting for a bit? Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy knowing who's in the room. One more thing, before we begin, this story contains fictional elements woven in for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside it. August in Seattle has a way of hinting at autumn, without committing to it. A blush of color at the tips of the leaves, a coolness in the early air that disappears by noon. No one phoned, no one dropped by. And that quiet, which usually suited me fine, had taken on a different quality. Less like peace, more like a held breath. 31 years I had owned this house. I'd cut every board on this porch myself, hammered every nail. I could tell you by memory which window frames groaned in the cold months, and which doorways would stick when the heat came. Lorraine and I had raised these walls the same way we'd built our whole life together, one careful step at a time, on whatever we could spare after the bills were paid. The neighbors had their own story about me, the retired construction man in flannel hauling around in that beat-up Chevy pickup, puttering in the vegetable garden out back. That story wasn't wrong as far as it went. At 23, I had been exactly that, a kid out of rural Kentucky with $300 in oil-burning truck and a woman at my side who was certain we could make something that mattered. What the neighbors didn't know was the rest of it, 4 decades of work that had turned those thin beginnings into a construction materials company, supplying half the Pacific Northwest's commercial builds, office towers, hospitals, government buildings across 3 states. We had put materials into the bones of all of it. By the time Lorraine and I handed off the day-to-day operation, the company's value would have startled every soul on this block. When she passed 3 years ago, I settled into a resolution: keep living exactly as I appeared. Same truck, same flannel, same Tuesday mornings at the farmer's market on Belmont. I needed to know who would still show up when there was nothing polished to draw them. I reached over and laid my hand on the arm of the empty wooden chair beside me. Lorraine's chair, the one she'd occupied every morning with her tea. The cushion had gone from a soft green to a pale, washed-out gray. I hadn't swapped it out. Couldn't bring myself to. "And happy birthday to you, old man," I said to no one in particular. The back door scraped open, and Mrs. Bet Drummond from next door appeared at the fence, a foil-covered plate in her hands. "Eugene, I baked you a blueberry pound cake." She called her white hair bright in the morning sun. "Don't tell me you went and forgot your own birthday." "Didn't forget," I said, rising to take the plate from her. "I just figured it didn't call for a production." "Everything calls for a production once you reach our age," she said, and laughed. "You heard from Claire yet this morning?" "Not yet," I said. "She'll call." Bet looked at me the way she always did when she felt I was letting the world off too easy. She'd watched Claire grow up from the time the girl was 7, back when she used to pedal her bike up and down this street until the lights flickered on. "What you need is company, Eugene," Bet said. "Not just cake." "I've got the maple tree," I told her. She shook her head slowly, but the smile stayed on her face as she turned and went inside. I stood there with the plate and let my eyes move across the yard. Every corner of it bore Lorraine's mark. Rose bushes along the south fence. Raised vegetable beds she'd assembled with her own hands. A trail of flat river stones she'd laid out one Saturday because she wanted something that looked permanent, like it had grown there on its own. I carried the cake inside, put it on the kitchen counter, and crossed to the cabinet beside the refrigerator. The bottom drawer slid open. There, half buried beneath a sheaf of old utility bills, sat a thick manila envelope. I hadn't touched it since the afternoon Lorraine pressed it into my hands 2 weeks before she died. She'd held on to me and said, "Someday this will matter, Eugene. Not for your sake. For the truth." I held my fingers against the envelope's edge for a long moment. Then I slid the drawer shut. My cell phone rang. I turned it over. Claire. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. "Happy birthday, Dad." Her voice carried that brightness it always did when she was feeling good. "I'm so sorry I didn't make it over this morning. Gavin had an early call." "Don't worry about it," I said. "Bet brought cake." "Oh, good." Dad, listen. Gavin was thinking, if you don't have plans next weekend, we'd really like to come over have dinner with you. He's been asking after you. I turned toward the kitchen window and the maple tree beyond it. "Gavin's been asking about me," I said again. "He has. He thinks we don't get enough time with you. We want to come spend an evening." "All right," I said. "Saturday works. I'll fire up the grill." "Perfect." A brief silence followed, and somewhere inside it, her voice shifted not much, but enough. "He genuinely cares about you, Dad. I just want you to know." "I know Claire," I said. I stayed in the kitchen after we rang off phone in my palm, thinking. 3 visits Gavin had made to this house over the past while. Every one of them had arrived wrapped in the language of family and carrying the weight of something else. I tipped the last of my tea into the drain, rinsed the mug, stood it in the rack. "He genuinely cares about you, Dad." I'd spent 4 decades sizing people up at negotiating tables long before Gavin Maddox ever existed. And the lesson that had never once failed me was simple. When a man puts that much effort into telling you how much he cares, he's circling something he wants. I went back out to the porch and lowered myself into my chair. The maple threw its shadow long across the grass. 2 weeks and those leaves would be red and gold all the way through. I lifted my mug, found it empty, held it regardless. Gavin had not made a single visit to this house without an agenda, and the agenda he presented was never the real one. They pulled into my drive at 4:00 in the afternoon, Gavin's new Audi, the 3rd one in 5 years if I was keeping count. I was keeping count. From behind the kitchen window, I watched Gavin climb out and straighten his jacket before his eyes even found the house. That was Gavin Maddox in a sentence, always performing even when he was certain there was no audience. Claire came around from her side with a bottle of bourbon and wearing the smile she put on when she needed a room to feel easy. She had Lorraine's eyes and Lorraine's way of making people feel warm, and somewhere down the road she had begun deploying both to paper over things that had no business being papered over. I pulled the front door open before they could knock. Claire came in and wrapped her arms around me, and for just a moment she was 12 years old again, and nothing was complicated. "You look good." "You say that every time?" I said. "Because every time it's true." Gavin followed her through, hand already extended. The handshake said, confidence firm, quick gone, before you'd fully registered it, as if he had somewhere else pressing to be. "Eugene," he said, "good to see you. Place looks great." "Looks the same as it always has," I said. He smiled at that. Then his gaze slid a fast-circuit entryway ceiling, the archway into the living room. The look of a man mentally pricing a property. I had watched plenty of contractors run that same calculation. I had run it myself, more times than I could count. I moved aside and waved them in. We settled at the kitchen table with the bourbon Claire had brought, and for a stretch, the evening almost felt ordinary. She talked about a friend's October wedding, a pottery class she'd gotten into, a documentary she and Gavin had watched on national parks. Gavin turned his questions on me, how the neighborhood was holding up, whether values had been climbing, whether I'd ever considered putting in a proper security system. "Good locks, good neighbors," I said. "That served me fine." Sure, Gavin said, nodding slowly. "But a property like this, the footprint, the location you're sitting on, something that carries real weight here, Eugene. Has anyone given you a recent appraisal?" I looked at him across the rim of my mug. "What would I need an appraisal for?" "Peace of mind, really," he said, spreading his palms. "Estate planning, knowing your numbers. It's the prudent thing." "I know what everything I own is worth," I said. Claire rested a hand on Gavin's arm, small, quiet. He eased back and let the topic go quiet. But letting go wasn't something Gavin Maddox actually did. He just found a new way in. After dinner, he asked whether he could take a look at the basement, said he was curious about the structure, wanted to get a sense of the foundation's condition. I told him it was solid concrete poured in 1991, never caused me a moment of grief. He said he'd love to see it all the same. I told him the tour ended at the kitchen door. He laughed. Fair enough. We took our decaf out to the back porch, the evening air cool, the maple shifting in a soft breeze, and I thought, Here it comes, the real reason he drove over here. I didn't have to wait long. Eugene, Gavin said, pitching forward with his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping into what I can only describe as his boardroom register grave, but approachable. The manner of a man laying out a sensible fix to a problem you hadn't realized you were carrying. I want to raise something, and I hope you'll hear me through because it comes from genuine concern. Go ahead, I said. Claire and I have been talking, and the truth is, we worry about you out here on your own. You're not getting any younger, and this is a lot of property for one person to keep up. And from a legal standpoint, if something were to happen to you, transferring this house could get very complicated. Probate can stretch on for years. It can bleed the estate dry. It can put the whole family through hell. Claire nodded beside him. Her hands circled her mug, her eyes resting on me, with something that resembled concern but had the feel of a line she'd rehearsed. What we had in mind, Gavin went on, is that it might make sense to add our names to the deed now, just as a precaution. Nothing would change about how you live here. This would still be entirely your home, but it would protect the asset and make things a great deal simpler when the time came. The porch held its quiet. A car moved past on the street out front. I studied Gavin, his pressed collar, the expensive watch picking up the last trace of evening light, the careful architecture of concern arranged across his face. Then I looked at Claire, and something tightened in my chest I hadn't braced for because she was watching me with eyes that were so much her mother's, and she genuinely believed what her husband was offering was an act of love. Gavin, I said, setting my mug on the porch rail. I appreciate that you've thought about it, I do, but this house is mine. I built it, I paid for it, and I intend to decide its future on my own terms in my own time. Gavin's expression held. Too steady. Of course, he said. Absolutely, just something to sit with. I've sat with it, I said. He lifted his coffee and let the moment go quiet. But there was a tightness along his jaw when he smiled, and his gaze had drifted somewhere behind the performance. He hadn't expected that answer. Or maybe he had, and this was always only the opening bid. Claire squeezed my hand on her way out. Thank you for dinner, Dad. It was a wonderful evening. Come back any time, I said. Without an agenda, she laughed, taking it as a joke. I stood on the porch and watched Gavin's Audi roll back down the driveway, its reverse lights bleeding red across the darkening street. Then it was gone. I stayed out there a long while. After one hand on the porch rail Lorraine had painted white 12 summers ago. The paint was lifting at the edges now. I kept meaning to get to it and kept finding reasons to leave it alone. Gavin Maddox had just tried to talk me out of my home smiling, warm his wife right there beside him, the whole room soft, with the appearance of family love used as cover. He'd been smooth about it, gracious even. But I had spent 40 years taking the measure of men across negotiating tables, and I knew the difference between a man who had accepted no and a man who was just recalibrating his approach. 3 days after their visit, I climbed into my old Chevy pickup at 7:00 in the morning for my weekly run to the farmer's market on Belmont, the same route I'd been driving for 11 years, down Southeast Division left on 39th, up onto the overpass, then the long, easy slope toward the river. I knew every dip in that road, every patch where the pavement buckled after a hard winter. I never made it to the market. I was midway down the grade when I pressed the brake pedal and felt it go soft beneath my foot. Not the solid resistance I knew, but something hollow, like pressing into wet sand. I pumped it twice. Nothing caught. The truck kept moving, gathering speed on the downhill, and my hands went white on the wheel before my mind had fully caught up with what was happening. Come on, I said aloud, harder than I felt. Come on, come on. I didn't let myself panic. I had come through tight moments before on job sites, at negotiating tables, through the worst stretches of Lorraine's illness. The thing I had learned in all of it was that panic costs you the 2 or 3 seconds that determine everything. I cranked the wheel hard, right aim for the gravel shoulder, and dragged the front tire into the curb to scrub off speed. The truck bucked, bounced off the concrete lip, and ground to a halt against a chain-link fence. My forehead struck the steering wheel. I sat there, hands still locked on the rim, breathing through it, while the engine idled rough beneath me and a woman on the sidewalk came running with her phone already raised. Sir, are you okay? I'm calling 911. I'm all right, I called back through the cracked window, though my voice came out thinner than I'd meant it to. The right side of my forehead throbbed where it had met the wheel, and when I brought my hand up to check my fingers, came back red. The paramedics were there in 4 minutes. They helped me out of the cab, sat me on the ambulance's rear step, held gauze to my head, and walked me through the questions name date who's in the White House. My chest ached on the right side, where the belt had locked hard across my ribs. My right wrist had wrenched against the wheel and was already swelling at the joint. At Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center, a young doctor in wire-rimmed glasses cleaned the cut above my brow and told me I needed 3 stitches and a wrist x-ray. Nothing broken, soft tissue damage. He told me I was lucky. I know, I said, and I meant it in ways he didn't. Claire arrived 45 minutes later, coat half-buttoned, breathless, as if she'd dressed on the way out the door. She pushed through the curtain of the examination bay and stopped when she saw the bandage her hand rising to cover her mouth. Dad, her voice broke. Oh, Dad, what happened? Brakes went out, I said. I'm fine. 3 stitches and a sore wrist. She crossed to me and held me carefully the way you hold someone you're afraid of hurting further. And for a moment, her arms around me felt like something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Then Gavin called. Claire put him on speaker. Eugene, thank God you're all right, he said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth, that boardroom concern. That must have been absolutely terrifying. I managed, I said. At your age alone behind the wheel, I hate to think how differently that could have gone, he said. Claire and I have been worried about exactly this kind of situation. I fixed my eyes on the ceiling of the examination bay. The fluorescent tube buzzed faintly above me. Have you? I said. We have. Honestly, Eugene, this may be the moment for a real conversation about your situation. A house that size, driving yourself everywhere, it's a great deal for one person to carry. Claire was nodding beside me, her expression soft and worried in a way that made my chest hurt worse than the seatbelt had. What kind of conversation did you have in mind? I asked. Well, Gavin said, we've actually been talking about whether it might make sense for us to move in with you, to help. We'd take the main bedroom, you'd have the guest room. It's closer to the bathroom anyway, and we'd be right there whenever you needed us. I looked at Claire. She took my uninjured hand in both of hers. It makes sense, Dad, she said quietly. We just want to take care of you. I kept my voice level. I'll think about it. Of course, Gavin said. Take all the time you need. We just love you and want you to be safe. After Claire left to pull the car around, I sat on the edge of the examination table, the paper cover crackling beneath me. My wrist pulsed steadily in its brace. The stitches above my brow tugged every time my expression shifted. I kept turning over Gavin's voice, and that phone, measured warm, landed at exactly the right moment. And then I turned over something else. 3 days earlier, while Claire and I had been clearing the dinner dishes, Gavin had volunteered to check on something in the garage. Said he wanted to see whether I kept a decent flashlight for roadside emergencies. I had been in the kitchen. He had been alone out there for close to 10 minutes. My jaw locked until I could feel the tension deep in my back teeth. I let out a slow breath through my nose and held myself still. Certain things need to be confirmed before they leave your mouth. And the call I needed to make wasn't to the police. Not yet. There are moments when the world narrows down to a single crystalline point of clarity. Sitting in that hospital bay with 3 stitches over my eye, and Gavin's voice still fresh in my memory, I had just arrived at one of those moments. I called Dale Kowalski at 7:00 the following morning. Dale had been working on my vehicles for 22 years, ever since I limped into his shop on Southeast Division, with a seized alternator, and he had it running again inside an hour without billing me for the diagnostic. He was the kind of man who reported exactly what he saw, nothing more and nothing less, which is the precise reason I trusted him. Dale, I said when he answered, I need you to pull my truck in and go through the brake system, all of it, top to bottom. Heard about what happened, he said. Word travels. You holding up all right, Eugene? I'm fine, but I need you looking at those brakes as though someone may have gotten into them, not a routine check, an investigation. A pause. How soon can you get it here? An hour, I said. Dale Kowalski's shop sat on a wide lot off Southeast Division, a low concrete building with 2 bay doors and a hand-lettered sign that had been weathering since the mid-90s. Dale himself was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with grease worked permanently into the creases of his knuckles, and the kind of economy around an engine that put me in mind of surgeons I had watched operate. Deliberate, unhurried, certain. He got the truck up on the lift and went to work. I sat on a metal stool near the wall and watched him move through the undercarriage with a drop light, quiet and methodical. 23 minutes went by. I didn't push him. Then he said, Eugene, come here. I got up and crossed the bay. He was crouched beneath the rear axle, the light angled up at the brake line, running along the passenger side frame rail. He tapped the spot with one thick finger. "This fitting right here," he said. "Rear brake line junction where the main line branches off to feed the rear calipers. Compression fitting. Should be torqued down solid. It's been that way since I last serviced this truck, which was 14 months ago." "And now?" I asked. "Now it's backed off," he said. "Not all the way, just enough. Quarter turn, maybe a touch more. Enough that brake fluid weeps out slowly under pressure. You'd never catch it sitting still. Wouldn't notice at low speed either. But on a downhill grade, when you stand on the pedal hard, the pressure spikes and the fluid bleeds out fast enough that the calipers lose their stopping force." My hand wrapped around the lift frame until my knuckles ached. "Dale," I said, "is there any way that happens on its own, vibration where road conditions?" He shook his head, no hesitation. "Not a chance. This fitting doesn't work itself loose. It takes a wrench. Somebody put a wrench on this and turned it counterclockwise on purpose, just far enough to create a failure without leaving it obviously disturbed." He looked up at me, his face gone very still. "Eugene, somebody tried to hurt you." The bay was quiet, just traffic passing out on Division and the faint tick of cooling metal. "I need you to photograph all of it," I said. My voice was steady even though something heavy had settled onto my chest. "Every angle. Write me a technical report what you found. What it means your professional conclusion. Sign it and date it." "You going to the police?" "Not yet," I said, "but I need the paperwork in order." Dale spent another 30 minutes documenting the fitting from 6 different angles and working through the rest of the brake system. He found nothing else disturbed. Whoever had done this had known precisely where to reach and precisely how little interference would be needed. That told me something important. This wasn't random. This was targeted knowledge applied toward a specific outcome. I thanked Dale, told him to fix the fitting and have the truck back to me by end of day, and walked out into the pale morning light. I stood by my car in the lot and took out my phone. Arthur Prentice had been my attorney for 20 years. He had handled every contract, every trust document, every piece of legal architecture Lorraine and I had assembled over a lifetime. He was 60 years old, methodical to the edge of being mechanical, and he possessed the quality I prized above everything else in a lawyer. He listened completely before he said a single word. I laid it all out for him. Gavin's Audi in the driveway, the questions about what the property was worth. Gavin alone in the garage, the accident, Dale's findings that morning. Arthur held his silence for a full 10 seconds after I finished. When he spoke, his voice had changed, not alarmed, but sharpened the way a good instrument sounds when it's taken up by someone who knows exactly what to do with it. "Eugene," he said, "I need you to do something that's going to feel completely wrong. Tell me. Don't confront Gavin. Don't change a single thing about how you carry yourself around him or Claire. Keep living exactly the way they believe you're living. Stay the same man they think they're dealing with." "And you?" I asked. "I'm going to start taking Gavin Maddox apart on paper," Arthur said. "Financial records business, filings, liens, judgments, everything. If he's doing this, there's a reason he's backed into a corner. I want to know exactly how cornered before we take one step." "How long?" I asked. "Give me 2 weeks." The sun had cleared the shop roofline and was cutting hard across the lot. I squinted into it, turning my wrist brace over in my other hand. "He came into my home," I said. "He put his hands on my vehicle. He could have killed me." "I know that," Arthur said, and for just a moment, the even calm in his voice gave way just enough to let the anger beneath it show through. "That is exactly why we're going to do this right." I pocketed my phone and stood there a moment longer. Then I typed out a text to Claire. "Claire, hey sweetheart, feeling much better today. Tell Gavin that if he and some friends are free in a few weekends, I'd love to have everyone over for a backyard BBQ, my treat." I hit send and watched the message go. Arthur had told me to act normal. I had spent my entire life appearing ordinary while building something no one around me could see. This time, ordinary was going to cost Gavin Maddox everything he believed he had coming. I found out later, much later, after it had all come undone, and the people involved had no remaining reason to defend their version of events, that Gavin had spent 3 days on the phone after I sent that text about the barbecue, not making plans, building an audience. He called Claire's college friends, 2 couples from his office, the neighbors on the far side of the property, and a handful of people from the homeowners association I had served on for 11 years. He told each of them more or less the same story, tailoring the particulars to whoever he was talking to. The through line never changed. Eugene was getting on in years. Eugene was becoming difficult. Eugene refused to accept help from people who loved him. It was sad, really. They were only worried about him. By the time those 15 people came through my gate on a Saturday evening in early September, they already carried a fixed picture of me in their heads. They weren't coming for a barbecue. They were coming to witness something. I knew none of that on the morning of the event. What I knew was that the sky was clear, and the maples along the back fence had started going at the tips, burning orange the way they always did at the turn of early September. And I had a full load of applewood chips soaking in a bucket by the grill, the way Lorraine had always insisted on. She used to say applewood was the only wood that tasted like it meant what it was doing. I never pushed back on that. I rarely pushed back on Lorraine about most things. And on the occasions I did, I was usually the one who turned out to be wrong. Gavin and Claire arrived 2 hours early to help with setup. Claire carried a potato salad through the back gate and kissed me on the cheek, and she had that genuine brightness about her, the kind she used to carry to family gatherings before things got tangled. Gavin shook my hand, gave my shoulder a single clap, and immediately set about rearranging the folding chairs in a way that made the yard feel like someone else's. I watched him shift them into a loose semicircle toward the middle of the lawn, well clear of the garden beds angled outward toward the grill and the house, the setup of an audience, not a gathering. "You've got a tremendous space out here, Eugene," he said, working the perimeter with both hands in his pockets, eyeing the fence line, the garage, the side gate opening onto the driveway. "Honestly underutilized. With the right vision, a property like this could be something else entirely." "I grow tomatoes," I said. "I find that's enough." He laughed and kept walking. Guests began coming through the gate at 5:00. I stood at the grill with my tongs and watched each one arrive. And I paid careful attention to the way they looked at me, not at the food, not at the yard, but at me specifically. A few of them went to Claire first before they acknowledged I was standing there, which was fine in itself. But there was a quality to how some of them approached deliberate a degree too gentle, the particular softness people reserve for someone they've been told isn't entirely himself anymore. Bert Kincaid, who lived 3 streets over, whose fence I'd helped repost after the ice storm 2 winters back, came over and took my hand in both of his, covering my knuckles the way you do at a funeral. "Eugene, you're looking well," he said with enough sincerity in his voice that it nearly came out sounding like relief. "Glad to hear you're doing okay. Claire mentioned you'd had a rough stretch recently." "A fender bender," I said, keeping my voice easy. "My wrist is in a brace, not a cast." Of course. He patted my forearm. "Well, you've got good people around you. That's the main thing at our age." I turned back to the grill and pressed the tongs together, one slow, deliberate click, and let the smoke climb straight up into the still evening air. A woman named Yvonne, one of Claire's old friends, someone I'd met perhaps 4 times, across 20 years, materialized at my elbow with a glass of white wine and a practiced look of genuine concern. "Mr. Carver," she said, touching my arm lightly, "I just think it's so wonderful that Claire and Gavin are so committed to being there for you. Not everyone has that kind of support. You're a very lucky man." My back molars came together. "Lucky in a number of ways," I said pleasantly. She smiled and drifted back toward the group. I watched her go and understood with complete clarity what Gavin had constructed. He had seeded every conversation before it began. Every person in that yard had shown up already oriented not as guests, but as a primed audience assembled to watch a reasonable old man arrive at the inevitable. At 6:30, Gavin tapped a fork against his glass, and the yard fell quiet. He stood near the middle of the gathering, with Claire beside him, relaxed, holding his drink with the loose confidence of a man who believed the room had already conceded to him. "I just want to take a moment," Gavin said, his voice warm and caring without effort, "to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and especially to thank Eugene for opening up this beautiful property to all of us." He swept his hand across the yard, across the garden beds Lorraine had planned on graph paper one winter afternoon, across the back fence I had built with her brother the summer we moved in. "This is a truly special place, and we just want to make sure it's well looked after going forward. Right, Eugene?" 15 faces turned toward me, soft and expectant. My grip tightened around the grill handle until the textured metal pressed ridges into my palm. I lifted my glass toward the group and held my smile exactly where it needed to be. "Nothing changes around here," I said, "that I don't personally decide to change." A few people laughed, reading it as a joke. Gavin laughed too, But above that easy smile, his eyes had gone flat and hard, the look that crosses a man's face when something hasn't come off the way he planned it. He'd thought he was building a stage tonight. He was right about that much. What he'd miscalculated was who was actually running it. Gavin raised his glass like a man who already held the deed to the ground he was standing on. I kept my eyes on the coals and felt the heat steady against my face. The evening was still very young. It happened at 8:47. I know the exact time because I had just glanced at Lorraine's watch on my wrist, a slim silver Belova she'd given me on our 30th anniversary, with the words still running engraved on the case back when I heard Gavin's footsteps crossing the grass behind me with that particular quality of purpose I had learned to recognize over a lifetime of watching men approach a table when they had decided patience was no longer useful. The grill had burned down to a solid bed of coals. Most of the food was gone. The guests had loosened across 2 hours of easy weather and good conversation. The talk spreading through the yard in that comfortable overlapping way that happens when people have stopped remembering why they came. Gavin touched my elbow. "Eugene, can we step over here a second?" He guided me toward the gap between the grill and the back fence, just far enough from the nearest cluster of guests to feel private, close enough that things could be heard if the volume climbed. That placement was not by accident. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, dropping his voice into a confidential register. "Tonight is a good moment. Everyone who matters is here. They all care about you. And I think if you just took the step of signing the transfer paperwork tonight right now, I've got it inside, it would be such a relief for everyone. For Claire, for you." I looked at him. "Gavin, my answer hasn't changed since the last time you asked." His jaw moved. "Eugene, you're being unreasonable. We are trying to help you. You're trying to take my house," I said. "There's a difference." The flush came up fast, rising from his collar, and I watched the polished exterior split at its seams. He moved closer, and his voice climbed out of its careful register. "You know what your problem is," he said loud enough now that the nearest guests had begun to turn. "You are a stubborn old man who cannot admit when he needs help. You're sitting on $1.5 million worth of property you cannot even maintain, and you're too proud and too selfish to let the people who love you do something useful with it." "Gavin!" Claire's voice came from behind him sharp. "Lower your voice!" But Gavin's hand shot out, grabbed my shoulder, hard fingers digging in, and shoved. I was not a young man. I was 72 years old, with a wrist still healing and a body that no longer absorbed surprises the way it once had. The force of it caught me mid-step and drove me stumbling backward, and my hand reached out instinctively for the nearest solid thing, which was the side rail of the grill. The metal was 400 degree. The sound it made, that brief and terrible hiss of skin against superheated steel, cut clean through every conversation in the yard. The pain in my palm was white and absolute, shooting straight up my arm to the shoulder. I wrenched my hand back and pressed it against my chest, breathing through my teeth, my eyes watering in spite of me. 15 people stood, frozen staring. Gavin was 2 FT away, chest heaving, one finger extended toward me like a verdict. "He stumbled," he said to the yard loud and fast. "You all saw it. He just stumbled backward." The pain in my hand was extraordinary, a deep pulsing burn that moved with every heartbeat. I pulled myself upright, pressed my burned palm flat against my shirt, and looked at the faces around me. Some were horrified. Some guests stood frozen, uncertain. Others were already doing what people tend to do when confronted with something they'd rather not witness, drifting their gaze elsewhere, finding a reason to look away. Claire pushed past Gavin and moved toward me. For one desperate, aching moment, I believed she was coming to my side, that she was going to take my hand and ask if I was all right, and be my daughter. She stopped 2 feet away and fixed me with a look I had never seen on her face before. Not concern, not guilt. Something closer to a frustrated impatience, as if I were a recurring problem she could not get to go away. "Dad." Her voice was tight-clipped. "You always do this. You make everything so much harder than it needs to be." She cut a glance at the guests around us, then brought her eyes back to me, dropping her voice just a fraction. "You are being selfish. You know that. You have always been selfish." My burned hand pulsed against my shirt. My eyes stung, and it had nothing to do with the smoke. I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her, at the hard set of her jaw, the way her body was braced and closed off, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not break, shift. The way a worn bearing finally seats itself somewhere new, somewhere it will stay. I reached down with my good hand, lifted the long-handled grill tongs from the side table, and laid them gently on the folded dish towel next to the cooler. I pressed my burned palm back against my shirt. Then I turned and walked toward my back door without a glance at Gavin, without a glance at the 15 people standing in my yard, and without a glance at Claire. My boots were heavy on the porch steps. The screen door swung shut with a soft bang behind me. And then I was inside, in the stillness of my kitchen, the smell of charcoal fading behind the glass. I walked through my own front door knowing it might be the last time I crossed it, as simply a quiet old man. What was waiting on the other side of that evening, none of them had the first idea. But I did. The last car rolled out of my driveway at 9:23. I know because I was standing at the kitchen sink with cold water running over my burned palm, watching the taillights vanish through the window above the faucet. Nobody knocked on the back door to check on me before they left. Not one of the 15 people who had stood in my yard 2 hours earlier eating my food and nodding along to Gavin's little speech had thought to step inside and ask about my hand. I found the first aid kit under the bathroom sink and cleaned the burn the way it required: cool water, loose gauze, no tight wrapping. Blistered skin needs air and time. Some injuries cannot be rushed. You have to let them move through their own process. I settled at the kitchen table, the gauze taped loosely across my palm, and I thought about Lorraine. Not the way I usually did, that soft, aching version that finds me in the early morning hours when the house holds its breath. This was different. This was the Lorraine who had sat across from me at this very table after every hard business decision we had ever made together. The one who would press her lips together and hold me with those steady gray eyes until I told her the truth about what was actually turning over in my mind. "He tampered with my brakes, Lorraine," I said. And tonight, he put my hand on a hot grill in front of 15 witnesses and called it a stumble. The kitchen gave me nothing back, but I felt her in the room the way I always do. Not quite a presence, more like a standard, a calibration. The measure I hold myself against when I am trying to determine whether I am moving from fear or from principle. Near the end, her voice worn rough by the medication, but her grip on my hand still firm, she had told me, "Eugene, promise me you will not let them mistake your silence for weakness." "I am not being silent anymore," I told the empty chair across from me. I just needed to be certain. I pushed back from the table, crossed through the laundry room, and opened the door to the garage. The truck sat there in the half-dark. Dale's repair on the brake fitting held clean and solid. I pulled the overhead light chain and walked slowly around the vehicle, one hand trailing along the fender, the way you circle something when you're trying to read it rather than simply use it. I stopped at the driver's side front wheel well and crouched down, which cost me considerably more than it once had, and trained the flashlight from the workbench on the undercarriage. Dale's work was sound. The fitting was torqued back down solid, but the scratch marks around it, the faint silvering of the metal where a wrench had bitten into the fitting housing, were exactly where Dale had pointed them out. A quarter turn. That was all it had taken. Someone had crouched in this very spot in my garage while I stood 30 feet away in the kitchen, making coffee, and moved a wrench a quarter of the way around. My burned hand throbbed against the gauze. I straightened up slower than I would have liked and pressed my good hand flat against the cold hood of the truck. Gavin had been in this garage for 10 minutes the evening he came with Claire for dinner. He had slipped back here on his own, claiming he was after a flashlight. He had a mechanical background, mentioned it once years back. Something about working on cars in college to cover his tuition. He had walked into my home and tried to kill me, and then he had sat across my dinner table and asked me to hand him the deed. I went back to the kitchen, sat down, picked up my phone, and called Arthur Prentice at 11 o'clock at night. Arthur picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting for it. "Eugene," he said. "He put my hand on a hot grill tonight," I said, "in front of 15 people." A sharp breath on the other end. "Are you hurt?" "I've had worse," I said. "Arthur, I need you to hear what I'm about to say, and I need you not to argue with me about it." "Go ahead." "I am not going to the police yet. I am not going to the hospital to document the burn for a report. I am not going to call Claire and have a confrontation. I am going to do exactly what you told me to do 2 weeks ago. I am going to act completely normal." My voice had dropped to something I barely recognized, something low and very, very level. "And then I am going to let Gavin Maddox walk himself into the worst mistake of his life." Arthur was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Then I will be at your house at 7:00 Monday morning." 6:58, I said. I make coffee at 6:45. He almost laughed. 6:58. He agreed. After I hung up, I sat for a long while in the chair at the end of the kitchen table, the same chair I had occupied for 31 years, the one that faced the back window and the dark shape of the maple tree beyond it. My burned hand rested on top of the table, gauze white against the wood grain. For the first time since the screen door had swung shut behind me that evening, something inside my chest loosened just slightly. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of a plan that has been quietly assembling itself for weeks, finally locking into its last piece. I had spent 40 years building things in silence, never needing an audience to do it. What I was about to build next would be the most consequential thing I had ever put together. And Gavin Maddox would not see a single brick being laid. Arthur Prentice arrived at 6:58 a Monday morning, 2 minutes ahead of when he said he would. In 20 years, he had never once been late to a single thing. I had always read that as a statement of character, rather than mere punctuality. He came through the front door carrying his worn leather briefcase and passed on the coffee I offered him, which told me more about the gravity of that morning than any word he might have spoken. "Sit down, Eugene," he said, setting the briefcase on the kitchen table and snapping it open before he had even pulled out his chair. Arthur Prentice was 60 years old, silver-haired with the bearing of a man whose entire career had been spent reducing large institutions to a manageable size. Every professional meeting I'd ever had with him, he wore the same cut of dark suit. And there was something about the way he laid papers on a surface methodical, unhurried, that gave them the weight of exhibits before you'd read a single word. He drew out 3 items and arranged them in a line. First up was Dale Kowalski's technical report, 2 typed pages signed and dated, Dale's notarized certification clipped behind them. The brake line fitting, the quarter turn, professional conclusion, deliberate tampering. Next came a thick binder-clipped folder. "Gavin Maddox," Arthur said, pressing 2 fingers against it. "The morning after your call about the garage, I started digging into his background. It took the better part of 48 hours to make sense of it because he'd layered things to look complicated. Strip all that away, though, and it's straightforward enough." He opened the folder and slid the top sheet toward me. A credit report, not a consumer pull, but a full commercial analysis, the kind that lays out business entities' outstanding judgments, lines, and obligations in columns sharp enough to read at a glance. "His personal credit score is 412, Arthur said, not a misprint. I stared at that figure. 412. Decades in business had shown me outfits running on fumes and clever accounting, but a personal score that deep in the floor tells one story, sustained unrecovered damage. "And on the business side?" I asked. He turned the page. 2 active breach of contract suits against his firm, both filed in Multnomah County. 1 from a client over alleged investment mismanagement, 1 from a former partner over profit distributions he never paid. There's also a personal guarantee on a commercial note that went into default 8 months back. The lender hasn't acted yet, but that window is closing. A pause. "And he's carrying a second mortgage on the downtown penthouse. Claire doesn't appear to know. He pulled that money out 14 months ago." Something locked in my jaw. I held my gaze on the papers and drew air slowly through my nose. "He's short," I said. "Critically short," Arthur said. "And the one thing close enough to him that could fix that problem fast is the deed to your property." The third item was a plain white sheet covered in Arthur's small, exact handwriting. 8 numbered lines. A blueprint. "Before I take you through the plan," he said, "there is something else you need to see first." He settled back and looked at me, the way he always did when the next thing out of his mouth required me to absorb it without flinching. "I believe Gavin intends to pursue a legal incompetency declaration against you," Arthur said. "That would require a medical professional to assess you and submit findings to the county court recommending that a guardian be appointed. Under Oregon law, once that petition succeeds the guardian, which Gavin would seek to become routed through, Claire gains full legal control over your finances and real property." Beneath the fresh bandage I'd wrapped that morning, my palm was throbbing. I pressed my hand flat against the table surface and kept my voice from rising. "He's going to arrange for a doctor to examine me," I said. "That's my read," Arthur said, "which means what I'm asking of you will demand more than you've had to give in a long time." He leaned in. "You need to become precisely what Gavin already assumes you are: muddled, exhausted, a step behind. No pushback, nothing that suggests you see what's coming. Let him feel the ground shifting his way." While you do that, Arthur continued, I'll be sitting down with Calvin Reyes at Cascade Trust Bank for a very thorough conversation. And I'll be finishing the legal framework so that the moment Gavin commits, he finds himself standing exactly where we've decided to put him. I pushed back from the table, reached to the cabinet behind me, and slid open the bottom drawer. Inside was the thick manila envelope I hadn't touched since my birthday morning, the one Lorraine had put into my hands 2 weeks before the end, telling me quietly that I'd need it one day. Not for myself, for the truth. I placed it on the table between us. Arthur's gaze went to it, then to me. She put it together herself, I said. She told me there would come a time when I'd need proof that couldn't be challenged. She was careful about it. That was her way. He drew the envelope toward him and opened it the way you'd open something that has waited a long time for this moment. 3 minutes he spent on the top documents, face composed, unreadable, the way it always went when he was taking something serious into account. Then he aligned the pages against the table's edge and lifted his eyes to mine, and I saw something in them I hadn't encountered across 20 years of shared work. Not quite astonishment, more like a man finally seeing the true scale of what he's been handed. Eugene, he said, his voice dropping, I think we have what we need. I wrapped my good hand around my mug of black tea, which had cooled while we talked. Then let's be certain we don't waste it, I told him. The envelope lay between us on the kitchen table. Beyond the window, the maple was lit up amber in the low morning sun. Lorraine had put that tree in the ground our first autumn in this house, saying she wanted something still alive and growing when neither of us was around to see it. She'd been right about a great many things. The morning after Arthur drove away, I began living as someone I had never once been across my 72 years. I became a man who couldn't manage. It ran against every instinct I owned. 4 decades of arriving before anyone else, of staying after the lights went down, of pulling apart problems other people had declared unsolvable. None of that prepared me for this. Acting confused and spent was like an actor stepping into a role that repelled him. You understand it's theater, but the only way it works is to disappear so completely into the part that it stops feeling like a choice even to you. 3 days after Arthur's visit on a Tuesday morning, I called Claire. I softened my voice, let it go thin and frayed at the borders, the sound of a man not getting enough sleep. Sweetheart, I said, there's something I want to tell you, and I'd rather you didn't worry about it. Her response came sharp and fast. Dad, what's wrong? This hand of mine has been giving me more trouble than I let on, I said. And the sleep isn't coming the way it should. I wake somewhere around 3 in the morning, and I can't quite put together why I got up. I let a long breath out slowly. I think everything is just landing on me at once. The truck, the cookout, all of it. A sound from her end, not quite a sob, not quite a sigh. Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have checked in before now. You have a life to live, I said. I only wanted you to know. Gavin and I will be there this weekend, she said, and her voice had that quality it got once her mind was settled. That's not a discussion. All right, I said, and I shaped the word to sound like something releasing. After I put down the phone, I stood looking at the kitchen ceiling for a moment. Letting my voice bend that way had cost me. Even a performance of weakness does something to a man whose whole life has been built around staying upright. The grocery store 2 days later was Arthur's idea, and its elegance was in how little it required. Gavin had told Claire he occasionally ran into the Fred Meyer on Division Street on Wednesday mornings before his schedule filled up. Claire had relayed this without understanding. She'd just handed me an opening. I pulled into that parking lot at 9:45. Wednesday morning, took a cart and moved slowly down the cereal aisle. When Gavin's voice drifted over from 2 rows away, I positioned myself in front of the oatmeal section and went still. I lifted one canister, studied the label, put it back, reached for the next one, studied the same label, set it down, then picked up the first one again. The sound of wheels rolling to a stop came from just behind me. Eugene! Gavin's voice was wrapped in that deliberate, attentive concern he deployed when he sensed he might be seeing something useful. Hey, what brings you all the way over here? I turned around, moving slowly, and blinked at him, the way a man does when a face hasn't quite slotted into place yet. Gavin, I didn't realize you came here. Sometimes, he said, what comes next is the moment I had been quietly building toward for a long time, and when it finally arrived, it cost more than I expected. Not just for me, but for everyone in that room. Before we get there, let me ask you this. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them directly or gather everything in silence first? Those flat, calculating eyes hadn't left me the whole time. "You holding up all right? You seem worn down." I lifted the canister I'd already put back on the shelf twice. "Oatmeal," I said. "That's what I came for." Can't seem to remember which variety Lorraine favored. Something crossed his face there, and gone barely a heartbeat. My stomach turned at the sight of it. Satisfaction. He smothered it fast, replacing it with a show of tender worry. But I'd caught the flash before it disappeared. I tucked it away and said nothing. "Steel cut was her kind," he told me. "Blue canister." "You're right," I said, and closed my fingers around the blue one, letting my hand tremble just enough. "Much obliged, Gavin." As I turned back toward the shelf, I heard the quiet telltale click of a phone camera. He fancied himself discreet. He wasn't. The Saturday that followed, when Gavin and Claire showed up for what Claire described as a check-in visit, I had sharpened the act considerably. I kept them in the living room the whole hour. In that hour, I walked through the same story about my old foreman Eddie from start to finish, then circled back and told it again near the end, as though it had never left my lips. Claire shot Gavin a look across the top of my head, brief, anxious. Gavin reached over and laid a hand on Claire's knee with the studied tenderness of a man auditioning for the role of devoted husband. "So, Eugene," Gavin said, pitching forward with both elbows on his knees, "have you given any more thought to what we talked about, the arrangement where we help manage the property?" "Which arrangement would that be?" I said. He blinked, recovered, let a soft smile arrange itself on his face. "Just us taking a more active hand in the day-to-day. A bit of legal standing so we could step in and handle things if it ever became necessary." I let the notion appear to land slowly as if hearing it for the first time. "That may not be the worst idea. I'll sit with it a while." Something shifted in Gavin's body. His shoulders eased down a fraction of an inch. He believed he had cleared a gate. "Take all the time you need," he said, voice warm and unhurried. "No pressure, Eugene. Whenever you're ready." Once they were gone, I went next door. Bet Drummond was out, working along the shared fence-line shears, moving through her rose bushes. She looked up when she heard me and stripped one glove off. "They didn't stay long," she observed. "The things to get to," I said. She held me in that steady measuring gaze she'd been training on this street for 30 years. "Eugene, I've been meaning to mention I had a camera outfit come by last month. New security system. Gets the driveway and the side yard." Her hand moved toward the fence bordering my backyard. "Catches a good stretch of your place as well, now that I look at it. Figured you ought to know." I followed her gesture to the camera tucked under the eave, its lens angled down and out toward the yard. The barbecue grill sat squarely in its field of view. "I'm glad you said something, Bet," I told her. She drew the glove back on and returned to her pruning. Gavin believed he was witnessing my unraveling. What he couldn't see was that every sure-footed stride he took in my direction was a stride taken with no awareness of what lay underfoot. The earth he was walking on had already been remade beneath him. Arthur rang me on a Thursday afternoon toward the end of September. The first words out of his mouth were a name I hadn't said aloud in close to 15 years. "Calvin Reyes," Arthur said. "Ring any bells?" I was out back pulling the last tomatoes of the season off the vine, the ones that had gone soft and given up on ripening. And I went still with one in each hand, while something warm spread through my chest. Not nostalgia, not quite. More the sensation of rediscovering a tool you'd set aside long ago and finding it's exactly the one the job calls for. "I remember him well," I said. "Branch manager at Cascade Trust Bank on Belmont," Arthur said. 4 years running. "And Eugene, he handles your primary accounts." I put the tomatoes down on the edge of the raised bed and rose slowly, pressing a hand into the small of my back. "What do you need from me?" I said. Friday morning, the three of us gathered at the bank. Arthur, Calvin, and I in the second-floor conference room, Calvin reserved for his most sensitive client meetings. One wall was glass overlooking the banking floor below. I chose a seat with my back to it and watched Calvin Reyes settle in across the table. 34 years old, carrying himself with the measured, deliberate ease that serious bankers acquire young and never put down, like a second skin, more than a second suit. Charcoal jacket, burgundy tie. His handshake was solid, and when his eyes found mine, they held the same directness and quiet gratitude that 15 years hadn't touched. "Mr. Carver," he said, "I'm glad to see you even if I'd have preferred better circumstances." "Come on," I said. "Last time I laid eyes on you, you were 20 years old weeping in the back aisle of a hardware store. Let's set the formalities aside." A real smile broke through for just a moment, unscripted, unguarded, before the banker's composure closed back over it. Eugene's, he said. Fair enough. I had come across Calvin Reyes on a Tuesday evening, in October 15th years back. He was perched on a stack of drywall in the rear aisle of Kellerman's Hardware on Southeast Division, where he pulled night shifts to help keep his mother afloat after his father walked out. An economics textbook lay open across his knee, and tears were moving silently down his face. When I pressed him on what was wrong, he told me he was $2,400 short of his senior year tuition, and the university was giving him until that Friday to sort it or lose his place. That night I went home and laid it out for Lorraine. She didn't pause for a second. Of course, she said. And the next morning, I went back to that hardware store and put a certified check in Calvin's hands drawn on our company account that took care of his tuition, his books, and 6 months of rent. He tried to give it back. His hands were shaking so hard the envelope rattled. You don't owe me a thing, I'd said. Finish your degree, do something worth doing with it. He had done precisely that. Now he drew a folder open on the table and began arranging papers between us with the methodical care of a man who had spent days getting ready for this moment. There are limits to what I can share, Calvin said, his eyes steady on mine. Client confidentiality is real, so I need to be exact about where those lines fall. A beat of silence. What I am able to tell you is this: in the last 6 weeks, someone came into this branch on 2 separate occasions. Both times they asked pointed questions about gaining access to another account holder's funds through power of attorney and about how real property gets titled over into someone else's name. My grip tightened on the arm of my chair. Twice, I said. Twice, Calvin said. I wasn't in the building for either visit, but the staff member who dealt with this person both times brought it to me because the account being asked about is one I oversee directly. He met my gaze. Yours, Eugene. Arthur pressed his palm flat against the table. Did anything happen to the account? Nothing, Calvin said. No authorizations went through, no money moved, but there's one more thing. He lifted a single page from the folder and rotated it across the table toward me. It was a loan application. The letterhead named a commercial lending outfit, not Cascade Trust Bank, but a secondary lender catering to people who couldn't clear the bar at a conventional institution. My home address appeared in the collateral field. My full legal name sat in the applicant line, and at the bottom, where the signature belonged, was my name written in someone else's hand. The burn on my palm down to a tight pink scar across the heel now pulsed once sharp, like a knock on a door. That signature, I said, holding my voice flat against the cold fury climbing from my chest into my fingers, did not come from me. I'm aware, Calvin said quietly. 20 years of your signature sit in our files. That is not it. He let a moment pass. Eugene, what was done here, a forged signature on a loan application with your home, put up as collateral without your knowledge, that's loan fraud and forgery. Oregon statutes cover it. So does federal law. This isn't a civil dispute. Whoever did this is looking at serious criminal jeopardy. I lifted the document and studied the signature for a long moment. The handwriting was close enough that a stranger unfamiliar with my hand wouldn't raise an eyebrow. But the pen pressure was off. And the way the letters joined in, my first name wasn't a motion my hand had ever made. I folded the page precisely along its center crease and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I'll need a formally certified copy of this, I said. Already taken care of, Calvin said, pushing a second copy across the table. Notarized with my attestation as branch manager that the signature fails to match the account holder's authenticated samples on file. Arthur reached over and collected the certified copy, tucking it into his briefcase without comment. I looked at Calvin Reyes across that table, at the composed, careful, loyal man he had grown into, and felt a surge of something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite pride, but lived in the territory between them. The particular feeling of having once made a choice that turned out to matter in ways you never could have foreseen. Thank you, Calvin, I said. He squared the remaining papers in the folder and drew it shut with quiet precision. You told me to do something honest, he said. I'm still working on it. Gavin had already forged my name once. A man who steps over that line once has already made his peace with the idea that the line doesn't apply to him, which meant he wasn't planning to wait long before he came back for the real thing, and next time he wouldn't be asking. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October in a black Mercedes that he parked too close to my mailbox, the way people park when they're in a hurry to be somewhere they consider important. I was in the kitchen when I heard the car door, and I watched through the window as he came up the front walk, one hand adjusting his tie, the other gripping a clipboard. Tall man, groomed, angular face, the kind that photographs well and listens poorly. He pressed the bell with the single confident stroke of someone who expected the door to swing open on the first try. I counted to 5 before I turned the knob. "Mr. Carver." He smiled with his teeth and not his eyes. "My name is Dr. Clifton Aldridge. I'm here representing the County Health and Wellness Division to conduct a routine cognitive assessment. Your family has raised some concerns about your ability to manage independently, and the state takes those concerns seriously." I looked at the clipboard he angled toward me. The letterhead read, "Multnomah County Adult Protective Services" in clean official type. But the paper had the particular brightness of something printed that morning rather than drawn from an actual government office. The notary stamp in the corner was the wrong shade of blue. I had spent 40 years reading contracts. I knew what a real government document felt like in your hands. "Of course," I said, stepping back from the doorway. "Come right in. I was just putting on some tea." He followed me into the living room and settled into the chair across from the coffee table with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being received in other people's homes. He positioned the clipboard on his knee, uncapped a pen, and swept the room with the appraising eye of someone inventorying assets rather than checking on a person's welfare. What Dr. Aldridge could not see, because it was fixed with a strip of industrial adhesive tape to the underside of the coffee table between us, was the digital audio recorder Arthur had helped me set up the previous evening. No bigger than a matchbox with a battery life of 16 hours. The record button was already pressed. "Let's begin with some basic orientation questions," Aldridge said, clicking his pen with the brisk efficiency of a man who had run this routine many times and found it tiresome. "Can you tell me today's date, Mr. Carver?" I furrowed my brow and looked at the wall, then the window, then back at him, the mild searching expression of a man consulting a mental filing cabinet that someone had rearranged without telling him. I trailed off, dragging the back of my hand across my forehead. "Tuesday. I know it's Tuesday because the recycling went out." A pause. "And the month August," I said with quiet, dignified certainty. We were 3 weeks into October. Aldridge wrote something on his clipboard without glancing up. "Who is the current governor of Oregon?" I named a man who had been out of office for 11 years. I delivered his name with the fond assurance of someone citing a trusted public figure. Aldridge's pen moved faster. We kept it up for 20 minutes. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I halted at 79 and told him the numbers kept shifting on me. He asked me to draw a clock showing 10 minutes after 11. What I produced resembled a clock the way a child's sketch resembles architecture, right in general concept, broken in execution. I handed it across with a small, abashed smile. He accepted it with the barely disguised satisfaction of a man whose expectations were being met exactly on schedule. Then he set the clipboard on the table, leaned back and rolled his shoulders the way men do when they believe the work is essentially done. He had stopped looking at me as a person. In his reckoning, I had become a settled matter. He pulled out his phone and composed a message with his thumb unhurried, the way someone texts when they believe they have the room to themselves. He spoke the words softly under his breath as he typed the habit of a man who had grown careless in the presence of people he didn't consider a threat. "Mr. Collins was right," he murmured almost to himself, eyes on the screen. "Significant disorientation, temporal confusion, executive function compromised." A small sound, almost contentment. "Easiest $15,000 I've made all year." He pocketed the phone, recapped his pen, and raised his eyes to me with his professional warmth fully restored, as though someone had thrown a switch. Every muscle in my body held perfectly still. My face kept its expression of vague, weary confusion, with the discipline of a man who had sat across negotiating tables from people trying to take things from him for decades. Dr. Aldridge rose, smoothed his jacket, and took up the clipboard. "You'll be hearing from the county office within the week, Mr. Carver," he said, slipping back into his official register as cleanly as changing a shirt. "We'll see to it that you're well looked after." "Thank you for coming," I said. My voice was soft and faintly uncertain, the voice of a man grateful for the attention. He let himself out. I listened to the Mercedes reverse out of the driveway too fast, the tires giving a short chirp against the dry pavement. Then I stood up, reached under the coffee table, and peeled the recorder free from its tape mount. At the kitchen table, I plugged it into my laptop and settled my reading glasses into place. The audio was clean, every word sharp and distinct, the room acoustics working entirely in my favor. Aldridge's voice, when he said $15,000, was as present as if he were still sitting across from me. I opened my email and attached the file. Arthur picked up before the second ring. Did it work? He confessed to the bribery on tape, I said, named Gavin by name, gave the dollar figure, called it the easiest money he'd made all year. A pause on Arthur's end. The particular pause of a man absorbing very good news with great care. Eugene, he said, send me that file right now. Already sent, I said. $15,000 to have a man declared incompetent. Gavin had purchased a medical opinion. What he hadn't grasped, what men like Gavin never grasp, is that the things you acquire illegally come with receipts you cannot take back. Claire came alone that afternoon. No Gavin. That was the first thing I registered when only one car door closed in the driveway, a single soft thud, rather than the paired sequence I had come to associate with the two of them arriving together. I watched through the kitchen window as she came up the front walk carrying a glass baking dish covered in aluminum foil. Something in the way she moved, head tilted slightly down each step, deliberate and rehearsed, told me she had walked through this visit many times in her head before she ever got in the car. I opened the door before she knocked. Hey, Dad! She smiled, and it was almost her real smile, almost the one she'd had as a girl, the one that used to travel all the way to her eyes. I baked something. She brought the dish into the kitchen and set it on the counter, peeling back the foil to uncover a deep dish apple cobbler, the filling still sending up faint wisps of steam at the edges. The lattice crust was golden brown, the kitchen carrying the warm scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. Something tightened in my chest, in a way I hadn't braced for. It was Lorraine's recipe. Exactly Lorraine's recipe. The apples sliced thin and layered rather than cut into chunks. The smell of brown sugar and the trace of cardamom. Lorraine had folded in one autumn and never seen fit to remove. Claire had stood on a step stool in this kitchen at age 7 and watched her mother assemble this very cobbler, and the smell of it reached me now, beneath all the strategy and calculation, in a place that was simply a man who missed his wife. You used Mom's recipe, I said. Claire's eyes went bright, and she pressed her lips together for a moment before she spoke. I found her recipe card in the tin box last week, the one with her handwriting on it. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. I thought it might be nice. For you. I looked at the cobbler and breathed through the ache in my chest. Lorraine, I thought, I know what this is. It still hurts. Sit down, sweetheart, I said. Let me get some plates. Actually, Dad. She reached into the tote bag she'd set on the chair beside her and drew out a manila folder, thicker than something casual, thinner than a legal brief. She placed it on the kitchen table with a deliberateness that was just a degree too careful. There's something I wanted to talk to you about first, if that's all right. I settled into the chair across from her, let my shoulders curve inward and folded my hands on the table, the way a worn-out man does when there's nothing left to do with them. What is it, Em? She opened the folder and slid a multi-page document toward me, smoothing it flat with her palm. A young woman I hadn't noticed rose quietly from the chair near the window, a notary brought along to make everything official the instant I signed. She set her stamp on the table without a word and laced her fingers together. Gavin and I have been working with a family law specialist. Claire said, her voice gentle and calibrated in the way of someone who has rehearsed a tone. What we learned is that as things stand, if something happened to you, if you got sick or needed care or couldn't manage on your own, we'd have no quick legal ability to step in. Everything would have to go through probate. It could drag on for years and cost a fortune. Well, that sounds serious, I said, letting my brow furrow with slow, cloudy concern. It is, Dad. So, what this document does, she tapped the top page, is give Gavin and me a durable power of attorney. If you ever need us to act on your behalf, we can. Pay your bills, handle the property, make sure you're looked after. She paused, her eyes soft and earnest. It doesn't take anything away from you. You're still in control. It just means we can help when you need us to. A durable power of attorney in Oregon, when signed and notarized, hands the designated agent sweeping legal authority over the grantor's financial assets and real property, including the power to sell, transfer, or encumber that property on the grantor's behalf. It is among the most powerful instruments in estate law, and in the wrong hands among the most dangerous. What Claire had laid in front of me was no limited assistance form. It was a full financial takeover dressed up in the language of family care. I leaned forward, squinting at the text, turning the pages one at a time with a single finger. My eyes aren't what they were, I said. Can you read me the important parts, sweetheart? She read. She gave me the passages she wanted me to hear, the words about care assistance family, and moved through the operative clauses, briskly, her voice staying warm and level. She did not read me the section on page 3 that authorized the liquidation of real property without the grantor's additional consent. I listened carefully to every word she left out. When she finished, I reached into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt and took out the pen Arthur had given me 3 days earlier. It looked like an ordinary ballpoint black barrel silver clip, the kind that sits in a cup on any office desk. What it held was a formulation of disappearing ink, a novelty product with a genuine chemical basis. The ink went down dark and appeared permanent on contact with paper, but broke down completely with prolonged air exposure, typically within 90 to 120 minutes, leaving no trace and no indentation. I clicked the pen. My hand trembled just enough to be persuasive. "You really think this will help?" I asked, my voice thin and hopeful. Claire reached across the table and covered my unsteady hand with hers. Her touch was warm, and it cost me something to accept it, knowing what it was connected to. "I really do, Dad," she said softly. "This is just us taking care of you, the way you always took care of us." I set the pen to the signature line and wrote my full name, Eugene James Carver, in slow, faintly uneven cursive. The ink laid down dark and clean across the page. Claire drew the document toward her the moment my pen came up. She didn't wait, didn't offer to cut the cobbler, didn't ask if I needed a minute. She folded the pages with quick practiced efficiency, slipped the folder into her tote bag, and was on her feet before I'd set the pen down. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" She leaned in and kissed my forehead, and I felt the long breath she let out against my hair, the exhale of someone who has been carrying tension for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. She was out the front door in and under a minute. Her car started reversed and was gone. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the apple cobbler still resting on the counter, still faintly warm. She hadn't taken a single piece, hadn't even picked up a fork. Lorraine had given 40 years to perfecting that recipe. Claire had used it the way you use any tool, efficiently and without sentiment once the work was finished. I looked at that cobbler for a long time, and my eyes burned in a way that had nothing to do with the cinnamon. Some performances are so locked onto the ending that the performer forgets to see the scene through. Claire had played her part exactly as Gavin had written it. What neither of them had thought to consider was that the ink she'd just watched me sign with would be gone by morning. Calvin called at 8:15 the next day. I was at the kitchen table with my second mug of black tea and the newspaper open to the crossword, which I hadn't actually touched. I'd been sitting there since 6 o'clock, watching the light shift across the backyard, thinking about the apple cobbler still under its foil on the counter, and whether I'd ever be able to bring myself to eat a piece of it. When Calvin's name came up on the screen, I answered immediately. "Eugene," he said. Beneath the professional steadiness of his voice was something else, a particular kind of contained energy, the sort a man carries when he has just watched something extraordinary happen and is working carefully to account for every detail. "I need to tell you about this morning." "Go ahead," I said. I set down my tea and folded my hands on the table. He told me everything in order, the way a reliable witness recounts events chronologically, without editorializing precise where precision mattered. As he spoke, I assembled the scene in my mind as vividly as if I'd been seated in the corner of that glass-walled office watching it all play out. Gavin and Claire had come through the front doors of Cascade Trust Bank at 9:52. Calvin knew this because the security system time-stamped every entry. Gavin had worn his charcoal suit, the one he put on when he wanted to project authority, and Claire had been carrying the folder. They bypassed the teller line entirely and went straight to the reception desk, where Gavin asked for the branch manager by name. Not by title, by name. Calvin said the detail alone told him everything he needed to know about how Gavin had prepared for this visit. When they were brought into Calvin's office and the door was closed, Gavin hadn't sat down. He stood at the edge of the desk, one hand resting on the polished surface, and opened the folder with the ease of a man laying down a winning hand. "We need to execute a withdrawal of $250,000 from Eugene Carver's primary savings account." Gavin had said, his voice carrying the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who fully expected to be obeyed. "We have a durable power of attorney signed and notarized authorizing us to act on his behalf." Calvin slid the document toward himself across the desk and settled his reading glasses into place. "I was thorough about it," he told me over the phone, and the quiet satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. Cover to cover every page, the notary stamp went against our reference file. The witness signatures got a hard look, and then I got to the signature line. He let the silence hang. "What was there?" I asked, though the answer had already formed in my gut before I finished the question. "Not a thing," that was Calvin's answer. A clean empty line, no ink at all, no indentation, no ghost of a mark, nothing that even suggested a pen had touched it. What happened next, Calvin told me, was both immediate and total. Gavin's face didn't ease. From composed to angry, it detonated going scarlet inside a single breath. He yanked the document out of Calvin's grip, flipped it over, hoisted it toward the window. Light ran his thumb hard along the signature line, as though sheer pressure might summon ink from nowhere. "That cannot be right," Claire said, her voice breaking upward on a sharp, disbelieving note. "I was standing right there. I saw his hand. I saw him put pen to paper. He signed that document." Gavin's voice had begun to shake every trace of the polished consultant he showed the world splitting open at the joints. "We were both witnesses. You've done something to it, treated it with some kind of chemical something." Calvin absorbed all of this the way a man absorbs things after 4 years behind a branch manager's desk, without flinching, without rising to it. He laid the document back down, squared its corners with deliberate care, and fixed Gavin with a look of quiet professional gravity. "Mr. Maddox," he said, "a document bearing no valid signature gives me no basis to authorize a withdrawal. That isn't discretion on my part. That's contract law, plain and simple." Then he let a beat pass. "What I am also required to tell you is this: walking into a financial institution with paperwork, you claim grants access to another party's account. When it carries no such authorization, is an attempt to commit financial fraud. Under federal statute, that exposure is serious." Claire made a sound Calvin struggled to describe, somewhere between a gasp and a low moan, and her palm went flat against her chest. Gavin thrust a finger across the desk at Calvin, his whole hand unsteady from the force of whatever was tearing through him. "Give me your supervisor's name," he said. "Give me the number for corporate complaints. Before this week is out, you won't have that chair to sit in." Without any visible change in his expression, Calvin slipped a hand beneath the desk and triggered the silent security alert, the unhurried motion of a man who had run that drill before. 90 seconds later, 2 members of the bank's security team were standing in the office doorway. "I'll need you both to stay where you are while we finish documenting this incident," Calvin told them. "No one from law enforcement is holding you here, but I have an obligation to file a fraud attempt report with the Federal Regulatory Authority, and I'll need to see your identification before either of you walks out." Gavin swept his gaze from the 2 guards blocking the exit to Calvin, then over to Claire, whose color had drained away until her face looked like old chalk left in the weather. For one unguarded instant, a fraction of a second, Calvin said everything Gavin had built around himself cracked through, and what came up beneath it wasn't rage. It was something nakeder than that. Pure animal fear. I was still sitting at my kitchen table when the call ended, letting the weight of the whole morning press down and settle. "Did they hold?" I asked. "They stayed long enough for me to get the incident report written," Calvin said. "Their IDs are in the file. The fraud attempt notification reached the Federal Regulatory Authority at 10:41 this morning." A silence on the line. "Eugene." When those 2 left this building, they had the look of people who had just discovered the drop beneath them is a good deal shorter than they believed. I said thank you, and meant it. After the call ended, I wrapped my hands around my mug of black tea. It had gone cold during the conversation, but I finished it anyway. Block 1 exit and a cornered animal doesn't lie down. It scrambles, it gets louder, and the next move is almost always more reckless. I knew Gavin wasn't finished with me. More than that, I was depending on it. The bank hadn't stopped him. I never thought it would. A man who has built his whole sense of himself on being the smartest person in every room does not walk away from one loss and call it settled. He pivots, he adjusts, he starts hunting for a different door. The question I was sitting with was how many days it would take and how far over the line he'd be willing to step. 7 days as it turned out, and the second answer reached further than I'd calculated, even accounting for everything I already understood about who he was. He rang on a Wednesday evening. I was out in the yard putting the garden to bed for the season, pulling old burlap snug around the rose bushes the way Lorraine had taught me to do it. My phone screen flared to life on the porch railing with his name on it, and I watched it glow through 2 full rings before I picked up. Eugene. Something fundamental had shifted in his voice. That smooth, managed consultant's tone he carried everywhere it was gone, and in its place was something stripped down and raw. The sound of a man who had been on the phone all week and had nothing to show for it. "I'm going to speak plainly." "Good," I said. "Then do that." "I have footage from the barbecue," he said. "Security camera footage. A professional edited it for me, and what it shows is you stumbling, losing your footing, falling into the grill. Nothing that led up to that moment, only the fall and your hand hitting the metal." He let a deliberate pause sit in the air. "If I bring that footage to the Seattle Police Bureau and tell them you've been circulating false accusations, they'll open an investigation into you for filing a false report. And with your recent cognitive history, I don't imagine that ends well for you." My fingers went tight around the phone. The burlap in my other hand stopped moving. "What is it you're after?" Gavin, I asked, and I let the fear he was looking for creep into my voice. "I want the house signed over to Claire and me," he said. "Quitclaim deed. Straightforward, no strings attached. The paperwork is already drafted. Friday morning, you come to my attorney's office, you execute the document before a notary, and everything stops. No footage, no report to the police. All of it goes away." I eased myself down onto the back porch step and looked over the beds I'd just tucked in for the winter. Lorraine's roses wrapped and sheltered against what was coming. "And what happens if I refuse?" I asked. "Every news desk in Seattle gets the video before Friday morning," he said. "I tell them a disoriented old man assaulted his son-in-law at a family party and then lied to the police about it. I mentioned the cognitive evaluation." His voice went tighter. "You won't come back from that, Eugene. Put your name on the deed." I drew a long breath and let it out slowly, giving it the sound of a man caving under weight. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice low and quiet. "Send the address over." The office turned out to be tucked into a strip mall on the east side of town. 2 small rooms crammed between a tax preparation storefront and a nail salon. The sort of place that moves simple paperwork for people who can't pay for a suite downtown. A bottom-rung strip mall attorney, Arthur had said when I gave him the address, was exactly the sort of attorney who'd skip a commercial zoning history search before putting his stamp on a property transfer. That gap was what I'd been building toward. I walked in at 10:00, Friday morning, wearing my flannel shirt and work boots, and Gavin was already seated at the conference table, a coffee cup at his elbow, carrying himself like a man who had mentally deposited a check that hadn't cleared yet. He looked rough, shadows bitten deep beneath his eyes, a tightness clamped along his jaw that wasn't there even 2 weeks ago. But the performance was warmed up. He got to his feet when he saw me wave me toward the opposite chair, with the easy manner of a man who considers himself the one running things. "Eugene," he said, "glad you came." I lowered myself into the chair without hurrying, laid both hands flat on the table, and turned my attention to the document the lawyer set in front of me. A quitclaim deed. My name in the grantor line, Gavin and Claire Maddox, named as grantees. The address of the property. Every right, every title, every interest transferred. Gavin leaned in, and the need that lives in men like him wouldn't let him keep quiet. When they believe the game is over and they've taken it, they have to say so out loud. Winning doesn't count unless it's witnessed. "You want to know what's always been your problem, Eugene?" His voice had dropped into something flat and contemptuous. "Your whole life you worked with your hands, and somewhere along the way, you decided that meant something, that digging in and hauling and coming home dirty gave you some special understanding of how things actually work." He moved his head slowly from side to side. "It didn't. It never did. Men like me, we work with our minds. We move money, we understand leverage. And right now, I am leveraging the only thing you have ever had, which is this house, and there is not a single thing you can do about it." I let his words settle over me, the way rain settles on stone. I looked at him across that table, at the expensive watch at the hollow, confidence at the frightened man living underneath all of it. And what I felt was a deep and particular sorrow that had nothing to do with defeat. I reached for the pen the lawyer had set beside the document. This wasn't the novelty pen I'd used with Claire. This was an ordinary ballpoint permanent ink, the kind that bonds to paper and stays there for a century. And this time, that was exactly what was needed. Arthur and I had thought through this moment with care. The disappearing ink had done everything we'd asked of it. It had pulled Gavin fully into the open-generated documented evidence of what he intended and purchased us the time we required to prepare what lay beneath him. But this deed had to be real. Only a genuine transfer would attach the commercial liability to him without any room for doubt. The trap had no teeth if the conveyance wasn't authentic. My hand trembled. just slightly, just enough to be read. If I put my name on this, I said, my voice worn down to something small, you will leave me in peace. Gavin worked hard to keep the triumph from reaching his face, but his jaw gave him away. Sign the deed, Eugene. I set the pen against the signature line and wrote out my full legal name, Eugene James Carver, in slow, deliberate cursive. The notary pressed his stamp before the ink had finished drying. Gavin lifted the document in both hands and held it the way a man holds something he has been reaching toward for a long time. His chest moved with something that was neither quite a sigh nor quite a laugh. I got to my feet, put on my jacket, and crossed to the door. At the threshold, I stopped without turning around. Read the full property disclosure before you act on that, I said. Drive safe, Eugene, Gavin said at my back. I walked out into the October sunlight and drew a long breath of cold, clean air. I took out my phone and pressed Arthur's name. He picked up on the first ring. It's done, I said. He accepted the notarization. The deed transferred at 10:47 this morning. And, Arthur said, he didn't pull the commercial zoning records, I said. Not one question about the property's history. A beat of quiet on Arthur's end. The specific quiet of a man who has been assembling something for weeks and has just watched the final piece click into position. Eugene, he said. He swallowed the whole thing. I walked to my truck, unlocked it, and climbed in. The engine caught on the first turn the way it always did. Gavin believed the instant I signed that deed was the instant I'd been stripped of everything. He had no idea that the moment he put his name on that document, he had agreed to carry a weight that might take him the rest of his life to set down, if he ever managed it. I stood on the sidewalk across from my own house and watched a locksmith drill out the deadbolts I'd hung there myself in the summer of 2000. Arthur had told me to keep my distance. I'd told him I needed to see it not from grief, but from certainty. A man ought to be present when the plan he built finally arrives at the place it was always pointed. I needed to watch Gavin standing in that doorway convinced he'd won, so I'd know without any question that the trap had closed all the way around him. The locksmith moved efficiently his van, sitting half on the lawn, his drill throwing small brass curls across the front porch. I had hung that door myself. I had cut the hinge mortises by hand, with a chisel Lorraine gave me for our anniversary, because she said a man who built things deserved proper tools. I watched from the sidewalk without moving. My hands were in my jacket pockets, my expression was steady, and my heart was beating exactly as it always did. Nothing I felt standing there came from grief. Only the quiet, settled satisfaction of watching a plan reach the exact moment it was built to reach. Gavin appeared in the doorway, observing the locksmith work with the proprietary energy of a man cataloging what he has just taken possession of. He didn't look across the street. He was already deep inside the story he'd written for himself, the one where the stubborn old man had finally been outfoxed, where the house was his, where everything ahead of him was clear. Then a dark SUV with government plates rolled onto the street and pulled up in front of my driveway. Two people in business attire stepped out, a man and a woman, both carrying document folders, both wearing the expression of people who have come to deliver information rather than to discuss it. They walked up the front path, and the woman knocked 3 times firm and unhurried. I watched Gavin open the door. I watched him take the documents they extended toward him. I watched his head drop to the first page, come back up and drop again. Even at that distance, I could see the color leave his face, the way color leaves something when the heat beneath it is abruptly withdrawn. I turned, walked to my car, and drove to Arthur's office. Arthur had the folder waiting on his desk when I got there. He rose when I came through the door, which he rarely did, and directed me to the chair across from him with a deliberateness that said he wanted me seated for what came next. Let me walk you through what Gavin just received, Arthur said, opening the folder and rotating it so the documents faced me. I want to be precise because the legal mechanism is specific. Go ahead, I said. 12 years ago, when the company was running at full capacity across 3 states, you needed a central location to stage industrial materials before transport commercial-grade solvents, treatment compounds, the sort of substances that go into large-scale infrastructure work. Arthur pressed a finger to the first document. Working through the county and the state, we registered the residential address as a commercial auxiliary transit point under Oregon's Business Property Code. It was fully permitted, fully documented, and tied directly to the corporate entity. And that registration, I said, stayed on the property. It never came off. Arthur said, A commercial auxiliary designation under Oregon code is attached to the physical address, not to whoever holds the title. When Gavin accepted direct transfer of that deed outside the corporate trust structure, he didn't simply acquire the real estate equity. Arthur's finger moved to the second document. He took on personal unshielded liability for every commercial obligation tied to that address. That means the outstanding commercial transition fees, the mandatory state audit for change of use classification, and the delinquent commercial reporting penalties that have been accumulating since the company wound down operations at that site. How much, I asked. Arthur turned to the folder's final page. The figure was printed at the bottom in standard government invoice format, clean official with no softening around it. $890,000 payable to the Oregon Department of Revenue Commercial Property Division within 45 days of ownership transfer. Non-dischargeable under federal bankruptcy statute, because it was a commercial regulatory debt, not a consumer obligation. I held my eyes on that number for a moment. Then I looked up at Arthur. He can't sell the house to clear it, I said, because the commercial designation freezes any transfer until the debt is satisfied. That's correct, Arthur said. He can't sell it, he can't refinance it, and he can't simply walk away. The debt is bonded to the deed. He folded his hands on the desktop. Gavin Maddox accepted a house valued at $1.5 million, and in the same motion accepted a regulatory liability of nearly $900,000. He is, at this moment, the owner of a property worth less than what he owes against it, with no legal path out of that position. The office held its quiet. Through the window behind Arthur, the October sky had gone the particular flat gray of a Seattle afternoon that hasn't made up its mind about rain. He went to a strip mall lawyer, I said, who charged him $800 and never pulled the commercial zoning history. Because a competent real estate attorney, Arthur said, would have turned up the auxiliary designation in the first title search and refused to move forward without a corporate liability release. He paused. Gavin was too impatient to be careful, and he was too certain he was the sharper man to examine what he was walking into. I got to my feet, buttoned my jacket, and lifted my hat from the corner of his desk. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. He looked back at me with something warm and steady behind his eyes. "Lorraine would have loved this part," he said quietly. I smiled at that. A real one. She'd have had the whole thing mapped out by the second visit, I said. Gavin Maddox had spent months trying to take a house worth $1.5 million. What he had actually taken was a liability worth nearly $900,000. The distance between those two figures was the entire remainder of his life. I was sitting on the back porch of the lake house when my phone rang at 7:12 in the morning. The lake house was 40 minutes outside Seattle on a private lot that Lorraine and I had bought 22 years ago under the corporate trust, a separate asset held in a separate entity never connected to the residential address Gavin had spent months trying to strip from me. He had never known the place existed. The morning I signed that deed, I had already moved everything that mattered out of the house on Division Street and brought it here. As far as he was concerned, the house he'd just drilled new locks into was the only home I'd ever owned. The surface of the lake that morning was perfectly still, a sheet of gray-green glass holding the October sky in its reflection. A heron stood motionless in the shallows near the dock, waiting with the infinite patience of a creature that understood time differently than men do. I looked at Gavin's name on my screen. I let it ring 3 times. Then I picked up. "I'm Eugene." His voice was unrecognizable. The consultants finished the measured confidence, the cultivated warmth, all of it was gone, scoured away the way a hard storm scours paint, leaving something raw and structural and ugly beneath. His breathing was ragged and too fast. "Eugene, you set me up." "Good morning, Gavin," I said. "Don't good morning me." His voice broke on the final word, splitting between fury and something much nearer to tears. They froze the property. The state came and put a freeze on the entire property. I cannot sell it. I cannot touch it. I cannot do a single thing with it because of some commercial designation you buried in that deed 30 years ago. 12 years ago, I said. And it wasn't buried. It is in the public record. Any title search would have turned it up in under an hour. You knew. The words came out broken and accusing and desperate all at once. You knew this was there, and you let me walk into it. You handed me a trap. I handed you exactly what you asked for, I said. My voice was very calm the way it became when I was certain of something all the way to the bone. You drafted the deed. You brought your own lawyer. You picked the location. You threatened me with a fabricated video to get my signature. I simply signed what you placed in front of me. A sound came through the phone that was neither quite a sob nor quite a shout. Something in between the sound of a man whose carefully built version of reality has just fallen in on top of him. I heard his breath labor in and out, ragged and wet. $890,000. He said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. Eugene, I don't have that. I don't have a fraction of it. You know I don't. I do know I said. So undo it then. His tone lurched into something frantic, words tumbling into each other. Call the county office. Call Arthur. Tell them it was an error, that you want the deed reversed. I will sign whatever documents you need. I will delete the video. I will go to the police and tell them what happened. At the barbecue was an accident. I will leave you alone, Eugene. I swear to God, I will never reach out to you again. I looked out at the heron standing in the shallows. It hadn't moved. Stop, I said. There is something I need you to understand. 12 years ago, when you were a junior analyst with a failed fund and $40,000 in debt, a private investment entity provided $2 million in seed capital that let you launch your firm. You told Claire it came from an anonymous angel investor who recognized your potential. The line went very quiet on his end, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. That investment entity, I said, was a blind trust funded entirely by Lorraine and me. We put that money behind you because Claire loved you, and because we truly believed that you might become a man worthy of that love. We handed you the foundation, and you used it to construct a lie, and then you used that lie to try to take the house that Lorraine's hands helped build. A long, terrible sound came through the phone. Gavin was crying, not the controlled, calculated tears of a man staging emotion, but something uglier and truer than that. The crying of a person who has just grasped the full shape of what he's done and what it has cost him. I didn't know, he said, his voice in pieces. I didn't know it was you. I know you didn't, I said. That is the saddest part of all of it. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the porch railing. The heron lifted from the shallows in one long, unhurried motion and crossed the water without a sound. Arthur's text came through 40 seconds later. FBI Financial Crimes has opened a formal investigation. Forgery and fraud charges incoming. It is over, Eugene. I picked up my mug of black tea and wrapped both hands around it, feeling the warmth spread across my palms, across the scar on my right hand, where the grill rail had burned me on a September evening that felt like a very long time ago. Somewhere across the city, Gavin Maddox was sitting in the house he had taken from me, arriving at the understanding that he had never been up against an old man. He had been up against the man who built him, and he had never once known the game had rules. What followed in the weeks after was nothing like the way people pictured justice arriving. No dramatic confrontations, no public confessions on courthouse steps. Only the slow, deliberate machinery of federal law doing what it was constructed to do, and a woman who finally stopped looking the other direction. Arthur called me on a Tuesday evening in early November, his voice carrying that particular quality it had when he was delivering facts he found both satisfying and sorrowful. When Gavin sat down with the FBI this morning, he said he gave them a complete statement. What did he say? I asked. He told them Claire planned everything, Arthur said. He told the investigators she pushed him into the property scheme, that she managed their finances, that he was simply a devoted husband doing what his wife asked of him. He described her as the primary architect of the fraud from the very start. A pause. He is trying to trade a reduced sentence for a co-conspirator. My chest tightened, not with surprise, with the particular grief that comes from watching a prediction you had hoped was wrong turn out to be exactly right. Does Claire know? I asked. She was shown his statement this afternoon, Arthur said. The investigator told me she read through the whole thing without a word. Then she asked for a glass of water and sat there holding it without drinking for about 4 minutes. I thought about Claire reading her husband's words, reading the portrait he had drawn of her, the way he had taken 11 years of marriage and reduced it to a legal instrument for his own survival. I thought about the moment she had understood fully and finally that the man she had defended against her own father was prepared to send her to federal prison to shave a couple of years off his sentence. She called me an hour later, Arthur continued. She didn't call a defense attorney. She called me. She asked me to tell her the truth about you, all of it. The company, the trust, the investment we made in Gavin 12 years ago. His voice softened just slightly. I told her everything, Eugene. I thought that's what you'd want. You were right, I said. She didn't cry, Arthur said. She just kept saying, I remember exactly, over and over. I didn't know. I didn't know who he was. And then she said, I didn't know who my father was either. I set my mug of black tea down on the porch railing and looked out over the lake. The surface was dark and still beneath the November sky. And the heron was gone for the season. Where is she now, I asked. That is why I'm calling, Arthur said. She drove to your gate about 20 minutes ago. She's been standing outside it ever since. She didn't press the intercom. She's just standing there. I went inside, pulled up the security feed on my tablet, and found the camera trained on the front gate. Claire stood on the far side of the iron bars in the light rain, her coat dark with moisture, her hair loose and damp against her face. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't rehearsing. She was simply a woman, standing in the rain outside a gate with nowhere else she knew to go. There was something Lorraine had said to me once, close to the end, when I confessed I was frightened of growing too rigid inside. Don't let your pride read their changing as surrender, Eugene. I put the tablet aside. I buttoned my jacket. The walls I'd built had been sturdy enough to absorb everything Gavin had hurled at them. Moving toward that gate, the question I couldn't shake was whether those same walls could hold against whatever stood on the other side of it. December settled in without ceremony, the way real endings tend to arrive, not as a detonation or a final reckoning, but as a hush that descends once the upheaval has passed and taken its share along with it. Arthur's message reached me on a Tuesday morning. I was out on the cedar deck, a mug of black tea at my elbow, and a newspaper open across my lap that I hadn't looked at once. My attention had been on the thin skin of ice along the dock's edge, the way the pale early light caught in it and stayed. The text said, 4 years, federal, full asset forfeiture, $890,000 in commercial debt remains attached to the property. The firm is dissolved. It is done, Eugene. I went through it twice. Then I laid the phone face down and lifted the mug in both hands, drawing the warmth into my palms, the way you do when the cold around you has gotten into your bones. Gavin Maddox was bound for a federal corrections facility for 4 years. That house, with its freshly drilled locks, sat encased in a commercial regulatory liability no bankruptcy proceeding could ever dissolve. The Audi, the penthouse, the fitted suits, the costly watch he'd habitually straighten before offering his hand, every last bit of it stripped away. Repossessed, forfeited, claimed by the workings of a legal system. He'd been so certain he outclassed the system. He'd mistaken for something an old man from Kentucky couldn't possibly navigate. I let that sit with me for a time. Triumph wasn't what I found there. What I found was the specific stillness that visits a man who has shouldered a great load across a great distance and has at last been given permission to lay it down. Claire pulled up at 2:00 in the afternoon. I caught the sound of her tires on the gravel before she came into view, and I'd already positioned myself on the front steps by the time she rounded the bend in the path. The coat she wore was unfamiliar, dark, unadorned, built for function rather than impression. Nothing at all like the carefully assembled outfits she used to arrive in when she and Gavin came together. Her hair fell loose around her face, and her face itself, it was open in a raw, unguarded way I hadn't seen from her in years, every layer of practiced composure worn away. She drew up at the foot of the steps and lifted her eyes to mine, and her chin was shaking so badly she had to clench her jaw to stop herself from fracturing apart right there on the path. Dad! The word fractured coming out of her, weighted down by everything she'd carried to the door with it. I don't know where to begin. Begin with what is true, I told her. It is always enough. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, her whole frame trembling. Then she hauled in a breath that shuddered all the way down, and met my eyes with her mother's eyes, swollen, exhausted, and stripped of every pretense at last. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice gave way completely at the end of it. The tears ran faster than her hands could follow them. I'm sorry for every last thing, Dad. For not asking whether you were hurting when your hand was on fire. For getting up in front of all those people and calling you selfish while you stood there bleeding. Her palms pressed hard against her sternum, as though something inside needed holding in place. For always picking him. Every single time there was a choice, I picked him over you. And you never once stopped being my father. Not for a single day. Something cinched tight in my throat that I hadn't been braced for, and heat gathered at the corners of my eyes. I let it stay there. There are things that deserve to pass through you without being stopped. I came down off those 2 steps, and stood before my daughter and looked at her the way I'd been withholding from myself for months now. Not as someone who had opposed me, not as someone who had let me down, but as the child Lorraine and I had carried home from the hospital 39 years ago. The little girl who used to go boneless and fall asleep against my arm on the ride back from job sites. "I forgive you, Claire," I said, "every bit of it, without reservation." The sound she made belonged to no clear category, not quite weeping, not quite speech, something that surfaced from somewhere beneath either, and her legs went briefly soft before she caught the porch railing with one hand. I moved to steady her, and both her hands locked around my forearm and held with the grip of someone who has been adrift a long time and has finally caught something solid. We stayed that way for a stretch, and I could feel the accumulated weight of the past 4 months pass between us and begin almost imperceptibly to rearrange itself. Then I eased back, because there was more she needed to take with her. "But, Claire," I said quietly, not harshly, "forgiveness and return are two different things. Where we were before isn't a place either of us can go back to. The work ahead of you is building something that belongs to you, not financed by me, not propped up by someone else's persona." I held her gaze. "Built by your own hands, the same way your mother built hers, the same way I built mine, starting from the earth one honest day laid on top of another." She gave a single nod and used her sleeve to clear her face. Her breathing was still jagged, but something behind her eyes had come back into focus that hadn't been there when she arrived. She started up the path to leave, and near the top, she stopped and turned back one last time. Her chin was raised now, eyes still raw and glistening, but the voice that came out of her had steadied. "Mom would be so proud of you," she said. I watched her move toward her car without speaking. I held my place on the steps until her taillights curved out of sight around the bend. Then I went back inside, slid open the bottom kitchen drawer, and brought out the manila envelope for the last time. Out on the cedar deck, I settled into the chair angled toward the water and unfolded it in the winter air. 3 pages in Lorraine's hand, each line, written with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything that truly mattered. I didn't skip a word. When the last line was behind me, I refolded the letter along the creases it already knew and pressed it to my chest. My eyes fell shut. Below me, the lake lay without a ripple. She had written, "The measure of a man is not what he builds, Eugene. It is what he refuses to let be taken from him. Not the house, not the money, his dignity. Yours has never left you, not once. I have always known that. I always will." I opened my eyes. The December light came down thin and clear across the water, and it was enough. If you've made it this far with me, then you know this story didn't end the way Gavin expected. And honestly, it didn't end the way I expected either, not entirely. Carrying all of this, the betrayal, the patience required, the silence I had to hold for months, it left marks on me. I won't pretend otherwise. But I believe God places certain trials in a man's path, not to break him, but to show him what he's still made of when everything comfortable has been stripped away. That's what I held on to through the worst of it. Not anger, just the quiet certainty that the truth had its own weight, and that weight would eventually land where it belonged. If these grandpa revenge stories teach anything, it's this. First, never let someone else's urgency rush you into a decision. Patience is not weakness. It is the sharpest tool a man owns. Second, document everything. A man who keeps records is a man who can prove what happened when the story gets rewritten against him. Third, the ones who try to take from you quietly are counting on you to be too proud or too tired to look closely. Look closely. Fourth, forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. You can open a door for someone without handing them the key. These are the father stories worth telling, not because they always end cleanly, but because they remind us that a man who stands on solid ground is very hard to move. If this one meant something to you, share it with someone who could use it today. And if you haven't already, come back and subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you're here for the next one. Leave me a comment below. Tell me what part stayed with you or what you would have done differently. I read more of those than you'd think. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourselves.